The relationship between India and Pakistan. It's always complex, isn't it? A landscape marked by these real peaks of tension and then sometimes these valleys of uneasy calm.
Exactly. And recently, we definitely saw one of those peaks, a significant spike in activity followed, perhaps surprisingly to some, by a ceasefire.
Right. But beneath those headlines, the official statements, there's this whole complex web of actions, reactions, claims, counterclaims.
Absolutely. And what makes this particular period, this recent flare-up, so crucial to examine is just the sheer volume of different narratives flying around.
Mm.
You have military claims from both sides, diplomatic maneuvers happening, international commentary.
It's a lot to sort through.
It really is. It's
Yeah,
genuinely a challenge to separate the signal from the noise in all of this.
And that's basically our mission today, isn't it?
Mm.
We want to take a really close look at what unfolded, specifically focusing on what India called Operation Sindoor and everything that happened around it and after it. We want to understand the sequence of events, yes, but maybe more importantly, try and unpack what these developments might actually signify for the future of this relationship.
Sounds like a plan. Where should we start? With the operation itself.
Yeah, let's start there. Operation Sindoor. Okay, so from the Indian government's perspective, what was the justification? What was the narrative?
Okay, so India framed Operation Sindoor as a direct targeted response. They said it was triggered by a terrorist attack that happened back in April 2025 in Pahalgam.
Right, I remember the reports from Pahalgam.
And a really key element of their narrative, something they emphasized, was the precision of the strikes. They were very clear in stating that their forces operated without crossing the line of control or the international boundary, so staying within their own perceived territory.
Okay, so precision and staying within bounds. What else stood out from their initial claims?
Well, the speed and the claim deficiency were definitely highlighted. The Indian Air Force, the IAF, reported completing the entire operation in just 23 minutes.
23 minutes. That's incredibly fast for something like this.
It is. And tied to that, they asserted that they successfully jammed and bypassed Pakistan's air defense systems which are, according to reports, largely Chinese supplied.
Right. So if that's accurate, I mean, that suggests a pretty notable jump in India's electronic warfare capabilities, doesn't it?
It certainly would. Think of it like having a very sophisticated electronic key that can suddenly unlock a very advanced security system. It implies a certain level of technological edge in that specific domain.
And then Prime Minister Modi addressed the situation publicly.
He did. He gave an address, I believe it was at the IAF's Adampur Air Base, and he gave some specifics. He stated that 9 terrorist hideouts were destroyed.
Oh, yeah.
And that over 100 terrorists were, quote, neutralized. But, his speech went beyond just sort of military briefing.
Also.
He really framed it as a shift in India's strategic thinking. He talked about a commitment to respond to terrorism on India's own terms whenever and however they choose. He also made a point about not tolerating what he termed nuclear blackmail and sent a clear message that accountability would extend not just to the terrorists themselves, but also to any state sponsors.
So a much more assertive posture being declared there.
Definitely. And this ties into comments made by Union Minister Ashwini Vaishnaw, who characterized Operation Sindoor as an example of India's new identity, even suggesting it was the formation of a whole new strategic doctrine.
A new doctrine. That's a strong statement. Was there any independent sort of military assessment of how things played out?
Well, we saw commentary from military historian Tom Cooper. His assessment, based on the available information, was reportedly that India emerged as the, quote, clear winner in the air battle aspect of this engagement.
Interesting. And what about the specifics of the weapons used? India highlighted some of that, didn't they?
They did. The Indian Air Force specifically mentioned using BrahMos missiles. These were apparently launched from their Sukhoi 30 fighter jets, but crucially launched from within Indian airspace.
Though not crossing the border to launch.
Exactly. That aligns with their earlier statement. And the targets were said to be terrorist headquarters, specifically Jaish-e-Mohammed or JEM facilities in Bahawalpur, Pakistan.
Okay, Bahawalpur and the BrahMos. What's significant about using that particular missile system here?
Well, 2 things stand out from the reports. First, its alleged undetectability by Pakistani radar systems, and second, its speed. The reported flight time to Bahawalpur was just 45 seconds.
45 seconds. Wow. That leaves almost no reaction time.
Precisely. It's like, a lightning strike.
Yeah.
Very sudden, very little warning, which obviously provides a significant tactical advantage if those claims hold true.
And this ties into India's broader push for indigenous defense production, right?
Absolutely. It seems timed, or at least coincidentally relevant, that a new BrahMos missile production facility was inaugurated in Lucknow around this period. The aim is reportedly to produce about 100 missiles annually.
So scaling up production.
Yes. And this isn't just about domestic defense needs. It's also about India positioning itself as a potential defense exporter. A later statement specifically on Operation Sindoor re-emphasized the use of domestically developed, indigenous weapons and technologies throughout the operation.
Okay, so putting it all together, India presented this narrative of a swift, precise, effective operation using its own advanced weaponry, staying within its borders, and signaling a new, more assertive strategic doctrine. That's the picture from New Delhi.
That seems to be a fair summary of their position, yes.
All right. Now let's pivot. How did Pakistan respond to all of this? What was their narrative, their sequence of claims and actions?
Well, Pakistan's response was multifaceted and evolved somewhat. Initially, there were denials about any serious consideration of using nuclear options.
Okay.
However, those initial denials were quickly followed by unconfirmed reports, I should stress, unconfirmed, that their national command authority had met.
And for listeners who might not know, the NCA is Pakistan's top body for nuclear decisions, correct?
That's exactly right. So even the suggestion that they might have convened, whether true or not, understandably caused quite a stir internationally. It immediately raises the stakes, even if it's later downplayed.
Yeah, that sends a signal. Intended or not, what came next?
Well, then came some very serious allegations from Pakistan directed at India. They accused India of actually targeting its own cities and even religious sites.
Targeting their own sites.
Yes, essentially alleging a false flag operation designed, Pakistan claimed, to incite communal violence within India and blame Pakistan.
And India's reaction to that accusation?
Vehement denial. India dismissed these claims outright as baseless propaganda, completely unfounded, according to New Delhi.
Okay, so a war of words escalating there. But amidst these high-level accusations, there were real-world consequences on the ground, weren't there?
Tragically, yes. We started getting reports of civilian casualties on both sides of the border due to cross-border shelling and firing. And this included the truly heartbreaking news about the deaths of students in Poonch.
Just awful. A reminder of the human cost in all this.
Absolutely. Alongside this, Pakistan made claims about its own military actions. They stated they had used a large number of drones, Turkish-made drones specifically.
A large number. Any figures?
The numbers mentioned in reports were between 300 and 400. Pakistan claimed these were used in attacks targeting Indian military installations.
300 to 400 drones. That's a significant deployment, if accurate. Did India confirm these drone attacks?
India didn't specifically confirm the scale or success claimed by Pakistan regarding attacks on military sites. And relatedly, Pakistan also alleged that India was operating its own drones over major Pakistani cities. India, for its part, did not confirm these claims either.
So, conflicting accounts on the drone warfare aspect. Did Pakistan acknowledge any losses on their side from the Indian strikes?
Yes, they did. Pakistan officially stated that 13 of their military personnel had died as a result of the Indian actions.
13. Okay.
And in response, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif visited Sialkot. The purpose seemed to be to meet with soldiers who were involved in the confrontation, likely a move to, boost morale and show support.
And then there was this matter of compensation, which seemed to draw a lot of attention.
Yes, that was quite a significant announcement. Pakistan declared it would provide compensation to families affected by the Indian strikes. The amount mentioned was 1 crore rupees per deceased individual.
Which is a substantial sum.
It is. But here's where it got particularly complex and controversial. Reports suggested that this compensation scheme could potentially include a payment of 14 crore rupees, so 14 times the individual amount to the family of Masood Azhar.
Masood Azhar, the founder of Jaish-e-Mohammed, designated as a terrorist by the UN.
The very same. This was due to reports that several of his family members were killed in the strikes on Bahawalpur, which, as we discussed, India claimed targeted GEM headquarters.
Wow. The implications of a state potentially paying substantial compensation to the family of a globally designated terrorist.
It raises a lot of questions. It certainly does. As you said, the optics internationally are incredibly complicated. Why make such an announcement public? Was it internal pressure, an attempt at appearing even-handed within certain domestic constituencies, or maybe just an unintended consequence of applying a broad compensation policy? We don't really know the exact reasoning.
But regardless of the intent, the potential message it sends globally is problematic, to say the least.
Undeniably, it adds another layer of complexity to understanding Pakistan's position and actions during this period.
Okay, so after this intense period of strikes, counterclaims, drone activity, and sadly, casualties, things moved towards a ceasefire. How did that come about?
Right. The ceasefire agreement was reached following talks at the Director General of Military Operations, or DGMO, level. This happened on May 10th, 2025.
The DGMO hotline is the established mechanism for this, isn't it?
It is. It's the primary channel for direct military-to-military communication to manage border incidents and de-escalate. Interestingly, according to the Indian account, it was Pakistan that initiated the contact for these talks.
Pakistan initiated it. Any reason given?
India cited Pakistan experiencing technical difficulties in connecting the hotline from their end, implying a degree of urgency on Pakistan's part to establish contact and secure a halt to the hostilities.
That detail about the hotline, whether just logistical or something more, it does add a little nuance to the picture of how the ceasefire came together.
It does. It could suggest, perhaps, that the Indian strikes were having a significant impact, prompting Pakistan to actively seek de-escalation. But that's interpretation, of course.
Of course. Now, almost immediately after the ceasefire was announced, we had former U.S. President Donald Trump weighing in.
Yes, that created quite a stir. Mr. Trump claimed that he had personally brokered the ceasefire. He even mentioned using trade leverage as his tool to get it done.
Classic Trump claim, perhaps. How was that received?
It was pretty swiftly refuted. Both India and the U.S. State Department denied his claim. India was quite clear. They stated the decision to pause the fighting was purely bilateral, made between India and Pakistan.
And that it followed Pakistan's request for a truce.
Exactly. India emphasized that their actions had been effective, implying this effectiveness was the reason Pakistan sought the ceasefire. The U.S. State Department acknowledged they'd had conversations with both countries, standard diplomatic practice in such situations, but explicitly downplayed any direct mediation role. They certainly didn't back up the Trump claim.
So the official line from the involved parties was very different from Trump's assertion.
Very different. It seemed more like the ceasefire was a direct result of the bilateral DGMO talks, likely driven by the situation on the ground, rather than external mediation, especially of the kind Trump described.
Okay, so the ceasefire is agreed upon. Did the fighting actually stop then? Was the agreement respected?
Unfortunately, not immediately or entirely. India reported violations by Pakistan almost right after the ceasefire was supposed to take effect.
What kind of violations?
Specifically, drone incursions. India reported Pakistani drones crossing the border, and these sightings apparently continued in the following days. Drones were reportedly spotted near military installations, but also near civilian areas along the border.
That must have kept tensions high, even with a ceasefire technically in place.
Absolutely. India responded by activating its air defense systems in those areas. There were even reports of blackouts being imposed in some border cities as a precautionary measure against potential drone threats. It suggests the situation remained very fragile.
And how did India's leadership frame this ceasefire? Did they see it as a resolution?
Not at all. Prime Minister Modi himself explicitly characterized it as just a pause. He was clear it wasn't seen as an end to the conflict or the underlying issues.
A pause, not an end.
Exactly. And he went further, outlining what he called 3 new normals in India's approach. This seemed to be a reinforcement of that assertive stance we talked about earlier, basically signaling a lower tolerance for cross-border terrorism and a refusal to be deterred by nuclear threats.
So the new normals essentially mean India is setting a lower threshold for future military responses.
That seems to be the implication. A greater willingness to act proactively, perhaps, and defining the terms of engagement differently than in the past. It reinforces the idea of that new doctrine emerging.
And the continued drone activity after the ceasefire agreement. What does that signal?
Well, it's certainly concerning. It raises questions about, command and control over these assets on the Pakistani side, or perhaps the sincerity of the commitment to the ceasefire at all levels. And for the people living there, as you said, it just means continued uncertainty, anxiety, air raid sirens, blackouts, not a return to normalcy at all.
Right. Let's broaden the lens now. How did the rest of the world react to these events? What was the global media coverage like?
It was quite varied, actually. You saw different narratives playing out in international media. For instance, some outlets, Al Jazeera was mentioned as an example, seemed to frame India's actions, or perhaps the outcome, as showing weakness, despite India's own claims of strength and success.
Interesting. Weakness despite claiming success. How so?
Perhaps focusing on the fact that a ceasefire was agreed upon relatively quickly, or questioning the ultimate impact of the strikes. But then you had other major outlets, like the New York Times, offering a very different take.
What did the NYT report highlight?
Their reporting apparently emphasized what they called New Delhi's clear edge in the confrontation. They specifically mentioned the crippling effect the Indian actions allegedly had on Pakistani air bases. So a narrative much more aligned with India's claims of success.
So it really shows how the framing can differ dramatically depending on the outlet, their sources, their perspective.
Absolutely. It really underscores the challenge for anyone trying to get a clear, unbiased picture from afar. The same set of events can be interpreted and presented in starkly contrasting ways in a highly charged geopolitical environment like this.
And within India itself, what were the reactions? We saw some strong public sentiment emerge, didn't we?
Yes, very much so. There were quite vocal calls within India for boycotts against Turkey and Azerbaijan.
Why Turkey and Azerbaijan specifically?
Because they were perceived as having shown strong support for Pakistan during this period, or generally in their relationship. This sentiment translated into tangible actions. There were reports of people canceling travel bookings to these countries.
Really? Actual cancellations?
Yes, and some travel agencies reportedly even put a temporary pause on offering packages to Turkey and Azerbaijan. Alongside this, you saw social media campaigns urging people not to buy Turkish products, questioning Turkish businesses operating in India.
Even specific partnerships, I think.
Right. The partnership between the Indian airline Indigo and Turkish Airlines came under scrutiny from some quarters online. It shows how quickly these geopolitical tensions can spill over into, consumer action and economic pressure at a grassroots level.
And the potential economic impact. Could it be significant for Turkey and Azerbaijan?
Potentially, yes. India is a huge market, including for tourism. So a widespread, sustained boycott could certainly have noticeable economic consequences for them. It highlights how interconnected things are: diplomacy, public sentiment, and economic ties.
What about other major players? China, for instance.
China's reaction was, well, fairly typical of their stance in such situations. They emphasized the need for dialogue, for restraint, for de-escalation. Pretty much their standard line on India-Pakistan tensions.
And the nuclear angle. Was there a lot of international concern about escalation?
Naturally, whenever India and Pakistan have a serious military clash, the nuclear dimension immediately comes to the forefront of international concern. It always looms large.
Understandably.
However, in this specific instance, while the concern was definitely there, the assessment from many analysts seemed to be that the risk of actual nuclear escalation remained relatively low.
Why low, given the tensions?
Primarily because the conflict, as intense as it was in the air and with drones, seemed largely confined. It didn't escalate, for example, into major ground offensives or threats to existential interests that might trigger, the use them or lose them nuclear calculus. The engagement stayed within certain conventional bounds, which likely kept the nuclear risk contained, though never zero in that region.
Right, the risk is always there in the background. There was also a small diplomatic incident involving the U.S. and a journalist question.
Yes, that was interesting. At a U.S. State Department briefing, apparently officials blocked a question from a Pakistani journalist. The question was reportedly accusatory towards Prime Minister Modi, suggesting he wasn't welcoming the ceasefire.
And the U.S. blocked it.
They did, which was seen by some observers as indicating the delicate diplomatic tightrope the U.S. was walking, and perhaps, in that specific instance, a slight leaning towards not wanting to amplify criticism of the Indian position. It highlights the sensitive context.
And domestically in India, the opposition had questions too.
Yes, the Congress Party raised questions about the timing and veracity of Donald Trump's initial claim about brokering the ceasefire. They essentially asked the Indian government to clarify how Trump could announce it before official channels did, adding that layer of internal political debate to the whole affair.
So the event had ripples internationally, economically, and within domestic politics in India. Let's look more closely at some other internal developments in India around this time.
Okay. Well, in the immediate aftermath, there was a heightened security posture. Security forces launched search operations in the Riyasi district of Jammu and Kashmir, reportedly after spotting suspicious activity. Standard procedure, perhaps, but indicative of the alert level.
And politically.
Politically, you saw attempts to capitalize on the operation. In Bihar, the state unit of the BJP organized something called a Tiranga Yatra, essentially a flag rally.
To celebrate Operation Sindoor.
Precisely. Framing it as a success and linking it to national pride, which is, a common political tactic. Also, Defense Minister Rajnath Singh had a visit scheduled to the Bhuj Air Base, likely related to assessing readiness or boosting morale.
So a definite effort to project strength and link the ruling party to perceived military success.
Yes. But it wasn't all straightforwardly positive in terms of internal reactions. There was a significant legal development in Madhya Pradesh.
What happened there?
The Madhya Pradesh High Court ordered the police to file an FIR, a First Information Report, the first step in a police investigation against a state minister who was also from the BJP.
An FIR against a minister. Why?
For alleged derogatory remarks he made against a female army officer, Colonel Sofia Qureshi. She had been part of the official military team briefing the media about Operation Sindoor.
Derogatory remarks against an officer involved in the briefing. That's serious.
Extremely. The court's order cited potential violations of laws related to promoting enmity between groups and acts prejudicial to national integration and communal harmony. It really underscored the need for responsible language, especially when discussing the military and its personnel, regardless of political affiliation.
A strong message from the judiciary there about maintaining decorum and respect, especially on sensitive national security issues.
Indeed. It served as a counterpoint to the purely celebratory narratives, highlighting potential pitfalls in how these events are discussed domestically. Meanwhile, you still had figures like Union Minister Vaishnaw continuing to praise the operation and talking about that new strategic doctrine solidifying.
And military operations continued in Kashmir.
Yes. Shortly after Operation Sindoor, the Indian Army launched a separate operation codenamed Operation Keller in Jammu and Kashmir. This reportedly resulted in the neutralization of several terrorists, indicating that counterterrorism efforts were ongoing, separate from the cross-border strikes.
Okay. Now, let's turn our attention back to Pakistan and some of the internal challenges that seem to be highlighted or exacerbated during this period.
Right. This is an important dimension. Some analysts, like Dhruv Rafi in his analysis, pointed towards Pakistan's, let's say, long and documented history of allegedly supporting various militant and terrorist organizations.
Including groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed.
Exactly. Groups designated as terrorist organizations by the UN. And notably, the very groups India claimed were the targets of Operation Sindoor, particularly GEM in Bahawalpur.
And wasn't there a surprising admission from within the Pakistani government itself around this time?
There was, and it was quite significant. Pakistan's own defense minister, Khawaja Asif, was reported to have made a statement acknowledging that Pakistan had, in the past, supported these kinds of groups. He reportedly stated it had gone on for decades and characterized it as a mistake.
A public admission from the defense minister that supporting these groups was a mistake. That's unusual.
It's certainly noteworthy to have such a high-level official publicly acknowledge that past policy, even framing it as a mistake, is potentially a significant development. What it means long-term remains to be seen, but the statement itself was remarkable.
But did this reported admission align with Pakistan's current official stance on these groups?
Well, that's where the inconsistency comes in, because despite Minister Asif's reported comments about past mistakes, the official Pakistani line seemed to continue denying the present-day existence or operation of groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba on their soil.
Even though affiliates, like the TRF, were claiming responsibility for attacks.
Correct. The Resistance Front, or TRF, which is widely believed to be an offshoot or front for Lashkar-e-Taiba, was actively claiming responsibility for attacks in Kashmir around this time. So you have this denial on one hand and claims of responsibility from linked groups on the other.
This reminds me of comments made by Shashi Tharoor describing Pakistan as a, what was the phrase?
I believe he called Pakistan a master of denial. He cited past examples, like the denial surrounding the origins of the 26/11 Mumbai attackers, or the years of denying Osama bin Laden's presence in Abbottabad.
Right, and this pattern, this apparent inconsistency between acknowledging past mistakes and denying current realities, it makes building trust incredibly difficult, doesn't it?
It's a major obstacle. If you can't have a shared understanding of the present situation, it's very hard to move toward genuine dialogue or resolution. It creates this constant friction and suspicion. Without a clear reckoning, as you say, convincing the international community about commitments to counterterrorism becomes much harder.
And beyond the issue of militant groups, Pakistan seemed to be facing significant internal instability generally.
Yes, that's another crucial context. Pakistan has been grappling with serious internal security challenges for years. We saw reports highlighting the tragically high number of civilian casualties from terrorist attacks within Pakistan itself, the Peshawar school attack being a horrific example from the past.
And attacks on their own security forces, too.
Absolutely. Ongoing attacks by groups like the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, which is distinct from the Afghan Taliban, and also by various Baloch insurgent groups, primarily targeting Pakistani military and police. Plus, there's the recurring issue of political instability, the lack of sustained, stable democratic governance.
And economic pressures as well.
Very much so. There were reports around this time of desperate scenes, even stampedes occurring during the distribution of free food or flour. These incidents drew grim parallels with historical moments where severe economic hardship fueled social unrest.
So all these internal pressures, security, political, economic easiness, they must influence how Pakistan approaches its foreign policy, including the relationship with India.
Undoubtedly. A government facing significant internal threats, economic woes, and political challenges has a complex set of priorities. Its decisions regarding India, including escalating or de-escalating tensions, are inevitably shaped by these domestic calculations. The eventual request for a ceasefire, for instance, could very well have been influenced by a need to refocus resources and attention inwards.
It adds another layer of complexity to interpreting their actions. It's not just about the bilateral relationship.
Exactly. Domestic compulsions are always a huge factor.
Okay, so as we start to wrap up this deep dive, let's try and synthesize. We've seen significant military action, Operation Sindoor, which India framed as a precise, indigenous-led response to terrorism.
Right. And Pakistan offered a counter-narrative, alleging false flags, claiming significant drone attacks of their own, and acknowledging military losses while making that controversial compensation announcement.
Then came the ceasefire, agreed via the DGMO hotline, but immediately clouded by conflicting accounts of who initiated it, Trump's interventionist claims, and reports of continued drone activity.
Leading Prime Minister Modi to call it just a pause and outline those 3 new normals, signifying a potentially more assertive Indian posture moving forward.
Globally, we saw divided media narratives, calls for boycotts in India against perceived Pakistani allies, standard calls for de-escalation from China, and underlying concerns about nuclear safety, even if the immediate risk was assessed as low.
And internally, both countries saw developments, political rallies, and legal controversies in India and in Pakistan. That noteworthy admission of past mistakes, coupled with ongoing denials and significant domestic security and economic challenges.
So what's the big takeaway here? What becomes clear after sifting through all these layers?
Well, I think what really stands out, yet again, is just how enduringly complex and multifaceted the India-Pakistan relationship is. It's this constant dynamic interplay of military posturing, capability signaling, diplomatic messaging, domestic political needs on both sides.
And always that nuclear shadow in the background.
Always. And the narratives. The narratives are absolutely key. Both countries construct and project narratives designed to serve their strategic goals, to justify their actions, and crucially, to resonate with their own populations.
Which makes it so hard to find objective truth sometimes.
Extremely hard. And that, I think, is the fundamental challenge for you, the listener. Try and make sense of it all. You're presented with these deeply entrenched, often diametrically opposed narratives, rooted in decades of history and distrust.
So the critical takeaway is perhaps the need for critical consumption of information.
Absolutely. You have to constantly question the source, consider the motivations behind a particular claim, look for corroboration, and just be aware of the inherent biases woven into almost every piece of information coming from either side, or even from international observers with their own agendas.
It really highlights the need to understand the deeper context. Maybe a final thought for our listeners. Perhaps digging into that historical context, understanding the evolution of these national narratives, the role external powers have played over the decades, and never forgetting the real human impact these cycles of conflict have. Maybe that's essential for truly grappling with events like Operation Sindoor and its aftermath.
I think that's exactly right. Understanding the present requires a deep appreciation of the past and the complex forces still shaping this relationship today.